The story begins in the Murray household, set during a dark and stormy night. Meg Murray, a high school student, is struggling with feelings of frustration. She's upset with her school performance, and she doesn't fit in with her peers due to her awkwardness and temper. Meg is frequently teased and criticized by her teachers for not living up to her potential. Her younger brother, Charles Wallace, is an extremely intelligent but strange child, often thought of as peculiar by others because he speaks very little in public but can express deep, complex thoughts at home. He seems to have an almost telepathic connection with Meg, often knowing what she needs without her telling him. The story reveals that Meg's father, a brilliant scientist, has been missing for quite some time, though no one knows why or where he has gone. The family lives in uncertainty, though their mother, Mrs. Murray, remains composed. Mrs. Murray is a scientist herself and keeps hope alive that Mr. Murray will return. As the storm rages outside, Charles Wallace suddenly informs Meg and Mrs. Murray that they will soon have a visitor, though he doesn't explain how he knows this. The visitor arrives in the form of Mrs. Whatsit, an eccentric, somewhat comical older woman dressed in strange, mismatched clothes. Mrs. Whatsit enters their home without much concern for social norms, rummaging through the kitchen and making herself comfortable. She casually informs Mrs. Murray that there is such a thing as a tesseract, a cryptic statement that shocks Mrs. Murray, as the tesseract was a concept her husband had been investigating before his disappearance. Meg has no idea what this means, but she is intrigued by Mrs. Whatsit's strange behavior and her connection to her father's work. The next day, Charles Wallace takes Meg to visit the haunted house in the nearby woods, where Mrs. Whatsit is staying. Their neighbor, Calvin O'Keefe, a popular but sensitive boy from Meg's school, happens to cross paths with them. Calvin is drawn to the Murray family and their strange adventure, and he becomes fast friends with Charles Wallace and Meg. The three children venture to the haunted house where they meet Mrs. Who, another unusual woman who wears thick glasses and speaks primarily in famous quotations from literature, philosophy, and history. Mrs. Who is different from Mrs. Whatsit, but equally strange, speaking in riddles and allusions. She hints that the children are about to embark on an incredible journey, one that will involve the tesseract, a wrinkle in time. Mrs. Who also cryptically mentions that Calvin has a unique role to play in their adventure, despite him having just met Meg and Charles Wallace. The children don't fully understand what Mrs. Who is saying, but they trust her instinctively. They are filled with a mixture of excitement and fear about what lies ahead. The third mysterious figure, Mrs. Witch, finally makes her appearance. Unlike the other two, Mrs. Witch materializes slowly, at first just a shimmering presence, before fully taking form. Mrs. Witch has a ghostly, ethereal quality to her, and she speaks in an elongated, drawn-out manner. She is the leader of the trio of cosmic travelers, and she explains to the children that they are going to travel across the universe through space and time. Their destination is a distant planet where Mr. Murray is being held captive by a dark, evil force known as IT. The children are both frightened and exhilarated by the idea of traveling through time and space. They quickly realize that the three women are not ordinary humans but celestial beings capable of folding space and time in what is known as a tesseract. Mrs. Witch explains that their journey will be dangerous, as they are going to confront a force of great evil that threatens not only Mr. Murray but the entire universe. Despite their fear, Meg, Charles Wallace, and Calvin agree to go. The group's first stop on their journey is the planet Uriel, a beautiful utopian world filled with light and harmony. The landscape is breathtaking, with towering mountains, sparkling rivers, and fields of flowers. The children are awed by the beauty of the planet and the serenity of its inhabitants, who are described as centaur-like beings with wings. Mrs. Whatsit, in fact, transforms into one of these creatures and takes the children on a flight over the planet. As they soar through the air, the children's sense of wonder turns to dread when they see a dark, ominous cloud hanging over part of the universe. Mrs. Whatsit explains that this dark cloud is known as the Black Thing, a representation of all the evil and destruction in the universe. It is this force that has captured Mr. Murray, and it is spreading across the galaxy, threatening countless planets, including Earth. The children realize that their mission is not just about rescuing Meg's father, but about fighting against this evil force that seeks to control the universe. Chapter 5, The Tesseract. As the children try to comprehend the magnitude of their mission, Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Witch further explain the nature of the tesseract. They demonstrate how they can fold space and time, allowing them to travel great distances instantaneously. The concept of the tesseract is difficult for the children to understand, but Mrs. Whatsit uses a simple analogy involving an ant traveling across a string. By folding the string, the ant can reach the other side much faster. In the same way, the tesseract allows them to wrinkle time and space to travel between worlds. Their next destination is a planet inhabited by the Happy Medium, a kind, jovial woman who lives in a cave surrounded by crystal balls. The Happy Medium shows the children a vision of Earth, which is partially covered by the black thing. This vision deeply disturbs the children, as they realize that their own world is in grave danger. The Happy Medium explains that Earth has been resisting the black thing for centuries, with great figures such as Jesus, Gandhi, and others serving as warriors against the darkness. The children's resolve to fight the black thing is strengthened. Before continuing their journey, the children spend time with the Happy Medium, who helps them understand the vastness of the universe and the importance of their mission. The Happy Medium is able to show them visions of their loved ones back on Earth, allowing Meg and Calvin to see their mothers, and giving them a sense of peace and connection. Despite the gravity of their task, the Happy Medium's lighthearted nature and joyful demeanor provide the children with a brief respite from the darkness they face. The Mrs. W's prepare the children for their journey to Camazotz, warning them that the planet is controlled by a malevolent force that thrives on conformity and control. They advise the children to stay true to themselves and resist the temptations to conform to IT's will. Meg, Charles Wallace, and Calvin are scared but determined to press on, knowing that they must face whatever lies ahead on Camazotz in order to save Mr. Murray. When the children arrive on Camazotz, they immediately sense that something is wrong. The planet is unnaturally uniform, with every building, street, and even the people all looking eerily similar. As they walk through the streets, they notice that the children all play in perfect synchronization, and the adults move with a mechanical precision. Everything on Camazotz is controlled by a central force known as IT, and individuality is completely suppressed. The children are led to a large, menacing building known as Central Intelligence, where they meet a sinister figure known as the Man with Red Eyes. The Man with Red Eyes speaks in a hypnotic voice, and he attempts to control the children's minds. Charles Wallace, confident in his intellectual abilities, believes he can resist the Man with Red Eyes, but he quickly falls under IT's influence. Meg and Calvin watch in horror as Charles Wallace's personality is stripped away and he becomes a puppet of IT. Meg and Calvin, now without the help of Charles Wallace, continue their search for Mr. Murray. They are led to a room where Mr. Murray is imprisoned in a transparent column. Meg is overjoyed to finally find her father, but she is devastated by the realization that he is trapped and cannot escape on his own. Using the special glasses given to her by Mrs. Who, Meg is able to pass through the barrier and enter the column to free her father. However, their reunion is bittersweet, as Charles Wallace, still under IT's control, tries to stop them from escaping. Mr. Murray attempts to tesser them away from Camazotz, but the journey leaves Meg physically weakened and emotionally distraught. She is angry at her father for not being able to save Charles Wallace, and she feels guilty for leaving her brother behind. The group finds themselves on the planet Ixchel, a cold and desolate world inhabited by large, gentle creatures known as the Beasts. The Beasts are blind but possess a deep sense of compassion and understanding. One of the Beasts, whom Meg calls Aunt Beast, takes special care of Meg, nursing her back to health after her harrowing experience with IT. Meg is still consumed by her feelings of anger and disappointment in her father. She blames him for not being able to save Charles Wallace and feels that it is her responsibility to go back and rescue her brother. Mr. Murray and Calvin try to comfort her, but they too are unsure how to defeat it. Aunt Beast and the other creatures on Ixchel offer their support, but they cannot join the fight themselves. After some rest, Meg regains her determination and realizes that she is the only one who can save Charles Wallace. The Mrs. W's return to Ixchel and remind Meg that she has something that it does not, the power of love. They tell Meg that love is her greatest weapon against IT, and although this sounds simple, Meg struggles to understand how love alone can defeat such a powerful force. Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch send Meg back to Camazotz to face IT. Meg is terrified, but she knows she must go, as Charles Wallace's life and the fate of their family depend on it. Back on Camazotz, Meg finds herself once again in the presence of IT. It takes the form of a large pulsating brain that emits a hypnotic, rhythmic sound. It tries to pull Meg under its control, using the same tactics that ensnared Charles Wallace. Meg feels the pull of IT's power and struggles to resist the urge to fall into the same conformity and control that took her brother. In a climactic moment, Meg remembers the words of Mrs. Whatsit and the others, realizing that her love for Charles Wallace is her greatest strength. As it tries to manipulate her mind, Meg begins to focus on her deep love for her brother, pouring all of her emotions into this thought. This act of love breaks through IT's hold on Charles Wallace, freeing him from the brain's control. Charles Wallace, now free, recognizes Meg's strength and love, and together they resist IT. The connection between the siblings is the key to their victory, as it cannot comprehend or overpower the force of love. The Black Thing's grip on Camazotz is weakened, and the children are finally able to escape the planet. With IT defeated and Charles Wallace saved, Meg, Charles Wallace, and Calvin are tessered back home to Earth. They arrive in the Murray's garden, where Mrs. Murray and the twins are overjoyed to see them safe. Mr. Murray is also reunited with his family, and their long separation is finally over. As the children reflect on their journey, they realize that their adventure was not just about saving Mr. Murray or defeating IT. They have learned valuable lessons about love, individuality, and the strength that comes from being true to oneself. The cosmic beings, Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch, bid them farewell, their mission complete. Although the children don't fully understand the enormity of the forces they faced, they know they have made a significant impact on the universe's battle against the Black Thing. The story ends on a hopeful note, with the Murray family reunited and the children forever changed by their extraordinary journey through time and space. Like and subscribe for more bedtime stories in 10 minutes.